When the world's kindest man walked onto live television, no one expected war. Keanu Reeves came for a friendly interview, but what unfolded was an ambush that tested his patience, his principles, and his silence. Before millions of viewers, he stood his ground, and what he said next left the studio in absolute shock. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The morning sun over Manhattan had just begun to slip between the glass towers, flooding the ABC studio with its pale light. Inside, everything was already in motion. Studio technicians adjusted light panels overhead, testing exposure and color temperature. Red tally lights blinked on and off as camera operators rehearsed their pans and zooms. A warm-up comic worked the seated audience, tossing jokes to keep them lively, coaching them on when to clap, when to laugh, when to gasp. The sound of laughter echoed faintly, blending with the steady hum of the control room beyond the stage wall. Backstage, the air carried the usual mix of coffee, makeup powder, and quiet urgency. Production assistants darted between dressing rooms with clipboards and headsets, double-checking cue sheets and timing segments. It was supposed to be a smooth, easy show, a typical Tuesday episode of The View. But that morning, beneath the buzz of routine, something subtle shifted. Conversations were shorter, smiles tighter. Even the sound engineers sensed it, glancing at each other as if they could feel an undercurrent running just beneath the surface. Keanu Reeves stepped through the side entrance with the calm presence of someone who didn't need an entourage to make an entrance. Just one publicist followed, holding a single folder of notes. Keanu greeted the security guard by name, then stopped to chat with a crew member adjusting a light fixture. His voice carried the soft cadence people had come to know so well, low, measured, kind. The cameraman's assistant had a cast on his wrist. Keanu noticed, asked what happened, listened to the short story about a bike accident, then picked up a marker and signed the white plaster with a simple, "Heal strong, my friend." Moments later, he found the coffee table near the control booth. A technician was struggling to balance 3 paper cups while adjusting her headset. Keanu gently took one from her, steadying the tray. "Here, I've got it," he said, handing her one of the cups. She smiled, a little starstruck, but grateful. For her, that small act meant more than the 1,000 stories she'd heard about his kindness. In a side room, his publicist gave the day's quick rundown. "They'll open with the film The Guardian, Redemption. Talk about the stunt work, maybe a short clip. Then there's a little segment on your foundation, one lighthearted game before the break. Nothing controversial." Keanu nodded. "Sounds good. Just keep it human." But somewhere else in that building, someone was planning something very different. In the makeup room across the hall, Joy Behar sat under bright vanity lights, flipping through a stack of note cards. Each one was marked with red tabs and small handwritten cues. Her reflection stared back at her in the mirror, the familiar smirk forming as she read over her questions. Most were standard film trivia, charity mentions, friendly banter. But near the bottom was a section outlined in bold, privacy versus public responsibility. That was the one she lingered on. She'd written it herself the night before, long after the show's producers had approved their final rundown. In her mind, there were too many guests who came to the show pretending to care without proving it. To her, silence wasn't grace, it was avoidance. And Keanu Reeves, for all his humility and soft-spoken fame, had become a symbol of that silence. Joy's mind turned over her angle. She wanted to make it sharp but calm, probing but not cruel. Still, there was a flicker of anticipation in her chest, the same thrill she'd felt before every controversial moment that made her name trend online. In the main stage area, Whoopi Goldberg walked the perimeter of the set, reviewing her cue cards with a level of focus that only years of live television could teach. She paused near the audience seating, scanning the rundown again. Her brow furrowed slightly when she noticed Joy's extra cards tucked beneath the official list. She'd seen that look before, that subtle energy Joy carried when she was planning something unexpected. A part of her wanted to ask, to step in and settle it before the cameras rolled, but time was running short and the control room was already counting down to rehearsal. At the moderator's desk, Sunny Hostin sat with a tablet propped beside her coffee cup. She reworded a line about platform duty, changing it from a political question into something that sounded more philosophical. Her tone was always measured, but even she felt the tension in the room. A few feet away, Sarah Haynes looked over her cue cards and sighed. She preferred the lighter interviews, heartwarming stories, personal reflections, moments that reminded people the world wasn't always divided. Alyssa Farah Griffin rehearsed one of her follow-ups aloud, determined to bring balance if things drifted into confrontation. In the control room above the stage, a senior producer leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "We need heat today. Ratings have been soft all week." The other nodded reluctantly. A junior producer standing nearby frowned. "This one feels charged," he said quietly. No one replied. The red light above the camera flickered to life. The countdown to air was still an hour away, but already the stage pulsed with the rhythm of live television. Crew members darted between cables, finalizing sound checks. A digital clock on the wall flashed 9:02. The director's voice crackled through headsets, issuing rapid-fire instructions that echoed down the corridor. On stage, the sleek table gleamed under studio lights, mugs perfectly aligned, the backdrop glowing with the view's familiar blue and yellow palette. In the wings, Keanu waited patiently, listening to the faint laughter of the audience beyond the curtain. His calm presence stood in stark contrast to the energy swirling around him. A makeup artist gave one final touch to his collar, another to his hairline. He thanked both of them, then caught sight of a nervous young intern, standing frozen beside the teleprompter monitor. The kid's eyes widened as Keanu smiled gently and said, "You're doing great, man. Just breathe. You've got this." It wasn't scripted or performative, it was just who he was. Meanwhile, on set, Joy Behar leaned back in her chair, testing her microphone, her mind rehearsing lines she planned to slip in once the cameras were live. She adjusted her notes again, her fingertips brushing against the red tab that marked the privacy card. For a moment, she hesitated. Then her expression hardened. "This is good television," she thought. Whoopi, seated at the center, was quiet, her intuition buzzing. Years in the business had trained her to recognize tension before it broke the surface. She glanced toward the backstage entrance, half hoping Keanu's calm energy would soften the air once he stepped on. Up in the booth, monitors flickered with test shots. Camera 1 on the hosts, Camera 2 on the audience, Camera 3 prepped for Keanu's entrance. The director's assistant made notes on timing. 7-minute intro, 3-minute film clip, 2-minute Q&A. It was routine, predictable, a well-oiled sequence on paper. But the junior producer who'd spoken earlier still couldn't shake the unease. He stood near the stage doors, headset pressed tight against his ear, watching Joy. Through the glass, something in her composure looked rehearsed in a way that wasn't about comedy or charm. He opened his mouth to say something again to warn someone. Anyone but a senior staffer cut him off with a gesture to stay quiet. "Not today," the man said. "We just need a moment that trends." The intern backstage heard that and frowned. The word trends hung in the air like static. Moments later, Keanu was called to standby. The green room was a pocket of calm inside the storm of live television. Pale beige walls, muted lighting, a small couch, and the faint hum of a vending machine it was, where guests waited, collected themselves, and tried to breathe before walking into millions of homes. Keanu sat quietly while the makeup artist dabbed his forehead and checked the reflection under soft light. The woman's hands trembled slightly. She was new to the show. "Long morning?" he asked with an easy smile. She nodded, caught off guard by his tone. "It's my first live segment," she confessed. "My son's watching from home. He wants to be an artist. He's 16. Keanu's expression softened. "That's wonderful. Does he draw?" "All the time. Mostly comic art," she said, and her eyes lit up just talking about him. "He's hoping to apply to college next year, but we're still figuring out how to afford it." Keanu thought for a moment. "What's his name?" "Eli. He reached into his leather satchel, pulling out a small envelope. Inside were cards and notes he carried for moments like this. He wrote something quickly, folded it, and handed it to her. "There's a program I know that helps students in the arts. They don't advertise much. Tell him to reach out. Mention this note." The woman looked at the envelope, stunned. "You don't have to." He shook his head. "I want to. Tell him to keep drawing." Her eyes glistened. "I will." Moments later, an assistant producer entered, carrying a cardboard box. "Mr. Reeves, this just arrived from your team." Inside were several signed graphic novels and a note. "For the studio staff, especially the kids." Keanu began sorting them, placing sticky notes with each recipient's name. When his publicist suggested a photo for social media, he declined immediately. "No cameras," he said gently. "Just give them quietly. It's for them, not for a post." Around him, the crew's pace slowed. People who'd been moving on autopilot began to soften, smile, linger longer than they should. The atmosphere shifted not because of celebrity, but because of sincerity. Keanu leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. In his head, he repeated the small mantra he'd used since his early career. Be kind, be still, be ready. Outside the green room, footsteps echoed a different rhythm approaching. Joy Behar's heels clicked sharply against the tile floor as she made her way down the hallway. Her presence was unmistakable, brisk and deliberate. Crew members instinctively moved aside. The makeup artist quickly gathered her brushes, trying to appear busy as Joy entered the adjoining prep area. Her expression carried the calm of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. But her eyes had that particular glint the one producers knew to watch for when a segment might veer off script. Keanu opened his eyes when he heard her voice from the doorway. "So, we're the headline act today," Joy said, her smile tight. "Let's make good TV." Keanu smiled back, unbothered. "Let's make something honest," he replied. His tone was polite, but there was quiet gravity behind it, a weight that hung in the air for a few seconds too long. Joy chuckled, half amusement, half challenge. "Honest, careful. Honesty doesn't always test well." She walked away before he could answer. His publicist, seated nearby, frowned slightly. "You felt that, right?" He nodded. "I did." There was a beat of silence before she continued, her voice lower now. "I've worked with this show before. Joy has her moments, but that tone, it's different today. It feels personal." Keanu leaned forward, elbows on knees. "It's fine. Everyone's got their reasons for how they show up. I just don't want this turning into a fight. That's not who I am." The publicist smiled faintly. "That's exactly why they trust you on these shows. You bring peace into the room." Still, she checked her phone, scanning the producer's group chat. Something about the phrasing caught her attention. "Ensure Behar's questions have clearance. Do not remove segment card. Keep cameras on wide." It was standard language, but the do not remove note was odd. Usually, last-minute cards were flagged for moderation, not protection. Keanu stood and began his quiet pre-interview ritual. A few slow stretches, shoulders rolling back, neck relaxed. He steadied his breathing, slow and deliberate, grounding himself in silence. The chaos outside the door blurred into white noise. He whispered the same mantra again. This time, barely audible. Kindness first, truth second. The makeup artist who had finished earlier lingered in the hall. She watched him and whispered to a colleague, "He doesn't act like anyone else who's been on this show." Her coworker nodded. "Yeah, that's why people love him." No one knew that love was about to be tested. The minutes ticked closer to airtime, and the energy outside the green room thickened. Keanu could hear the stage manager calling out countdowns through the intercom. 30 minutes to live. Segment 3, stand by. The buzz of machinery, the shuffle of feet, and the muffled laughter of the warm-up comic seeped through the walls like an approaching wave. But inside the small room, everything remained still calm before the inevitable storm. Keanu slipped on his black blazer, the one his stylist described as comfortably formal. He never liked the feeling of dressing up for cameras, but he'd learned that sometimes presentation could open doors to connection. His assistant checked his mic pack, adjusted the cord behind his collar, then nodded. "You're set," she said softly. He gave her a grateful nod and sat down again, hands clasped loosely between his knees, gaze steady on the floor. For a brief moment, he seemed miles away from the present. Chaos surrounding him. His publicist re-entered, tablet in hand, scrolling through a message thread from the show's producer. "They've just updated Joy's question list," she murmured. Keanu looked up. "Anything major?" She hesitated, zooming in on a photo that showed Joy's note cards. At the very top of one stack, highlighted in red, were two handwritten words: "Silence equals complicity." The words were underlined twice, bold and deliberate. Keanu's brow furrowed slightly. "That's not part of the promo, is it?" "No," she said, exhaling. "It's new. It wasn't in the approved rundown." He leaned back, thinking, maybe she wants to talk about social causes. That's fine. I'll stay respectful. "Respectful, yes," his publicist said carefully, "but this could be a setup. Just be ready." He smiled faintly, a quiet kind of confidence that came from years of enduring uncomfortable questions, invasive interviews, and unfair assumptions. "I always am." The door cracked open, and a stagehand peeked inside. "Mr. Reeves, 10 minutes to air. You're up after the first break." Keanu stood, stretching one more time, his movements slow and grounded. Every muscle carried a sense of calm readiness, the same composure that made stunt coordinators call him a dream to work with. As he buttoned his blazer, he looked at his reflection in the dressing room mirror, gray streaks threading through his hair, eyes marked by both wisdom and fatigue. He whispered quietly to himself, "Kindness, always." Outside, Joy's laughter echoed down the hallway. She was chatting with Sunny and Whoopi, her voice sharp but cheerful, the kind of laugh that covered nerves with bravado. The publicist gathered her notes, closed her tablet, and followed Keanu to the door. When they stepped into the corridor, a hush seemed to ripple through the crew. The same intern from earlier, still clutching a clipboard, watched as Keanu passed. He couldn't to explain it, but the air felt heavier now. Just before Keanu turned the corner toward the stage entrance, his publicist caught sight of Joy at the host desk. That red card, "Silence equals complicity," was right on top, and she wasn't planning to keep it there quietly. The theme music swelled, lights brightened, and the studio filled with applause as the camera swept across the cheering audience. The lower third graphic flashed. Keanu Reeves, the Guardian. Redemption. The atmosphere pulsed with excitement, the kind reserved for beloved guests. Whoopi Goldberg leaned forward, her tone warm and familiar. "We have a very special guest with us this morning. He's a legend of the screen, a man whose kindness off-screen has inspired millions, and his new film is already breaking records. Please welcome Keanu Reeves." The audience rose to their feet as Keanu walked out from behind the curtain. He waved modestly, shaking a few hands, pausing to smile at a young fan holding a homemade sign. His presence carried no ego, only quiet gratitude. Whoopi met him at the center of the stage with an embrace, the crowd roaring their approval. "Welcome, Keanu. It's always good to have you here," she said, her voice genuine. "Thank you for having me," he replied, his voice calm, his eyes reflecting the warmth of the room. He greeted each host in turn, Sunny with a handshake, Sarah with a light hug, Alyssa with a kind nod. When he reached Joy, she remained seated, her smile tight, her expression unreadable. He extended his hand anyway, and she shook it briefly. The cameras caught her tapping the edge of her cue cards. Once Keanu settled into the guest chair, the conversation began naturally. Whoopi opened with a safe topic. "So, The Guardian. Redemption. Let's talk about this film. People are calling it your most emotional performance since John Wick 3. Tell us what drew you to it." Keanu leaned forward slightly, his hands resting loosely on his knees. "It's a story about loss, forgiveness, and what it means to find purpose after tragedy," he said. "There's action, of course, but underneath that is something more human, someone trying to do the right thing, even when it costs him." Sunny nodded thoughtfully. "There's emotional truth under the action," she said. You feel that this character has lived through something real. Keanu smiled faintly. That was the goal. The explosions are the surface, but what matters is what's underneath: grief, hope, and the courage to keep going. The audience erupted in gentle applause. His sincerity carried through the microphones like a heartbeat, steady and unmistakable. Whoopi leaned forward, clearly impressed. You've been doing this for decades, yet you keep finding new depth in your performances. What's changed for you over time? Keanu chuckled softly, brushing his hair back. I think I've just learned to slow down a little. In my 20s, I thought being an actor was about intensity. Now, it's about honesty. You can't fake emotion on camera. Audiences feel it when you try. So I try to live enough life between films to bring something real back each time. The audience applauded again, their energy rising with every word. Sarah Haynes smiled warmly. I think that's why people connect with you so much. It's not just the movies, it's how you show up in real life. Your foundation's been helping schools across the country, right? Keanu nodded, his tone modest. We've been able to support some education programs, yes, but the real heroes are the teachers and the parents. They're the ones who keep kids inspired when the rest of the world gets noisy. Sarah glanced at the audience. We actually have a teacher from one of those schools watching today. The camera panned briefly to a woman in the crowd, wiping away tears, holding a small handmade sign that read, "Thank you, Mr. Reeves." Keanu smiled, genuinely moved. That means a lot. Thank you for what you do every day. You make the world better in ways most people never see. The applause turned thunderous, echoing off the studio walls. Even the camera operators smiled behind their lenses. Sunny Hostin took her cue. It's rare these days to see someone who's both successful and grounded, she said. But you've managed to stay private while being one of the most recognized people on the planet. How do you do it? Keanu paused, thinking carefully. I think privacy is a kind of peace. I like being able to walk down the street and just see people. Not as fans, not as press, but as people. That's enough for me. Alyssa Farrah Griffin grinned. You say that like someone who really means it. Speaking of people, we got this fan letter from a hospital in Chicago. It's from a young patient who wanted to thank you for visiting their ward last year. She lifted a sealed envelope. We won't read her name, but she wanted you to know you changed her life. Keanu's voice softened. That's kind of her, but please don't read it out loud. That moment belongs to her. A hush swept the studio, and even Joy looked up from her cards, eyes flicking briefly toward him. The room held its breath for a few quiet seconds. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing Keanu's calm expression, the stillness that seemed to draw everyone toward him. He leaned back slightly in his chair and smiled at Alyssa. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just be present, he said softly. That's all most people need to know. They're not alone in whatever they're going through. The audience erupted again, not with wild cheers, but with something deeper respect. There was something almost sacred about the energy that filled the room. You could feel it in the way people looked at him, not as a movie star, but as someone who had somehow managed to carry grace through chaos. Whoopi, ever the steady hand of the show, guided the moment gently forward. That's beautiful, Keanu. You've always had this balance between the big Hollywood life and a simple one. You keep things grounded. How? Keanu smiled, glancing toward the ceiling lights, as if searching for the right words. I think it's about remembering that all of this, he gestured lightly toward the set, the cameras, the audience, it's temporary. The people we love, the things we give, the moments we share, that's what lasts. Fame is like wind. It comes and goes. The audience clapped again, a long, rolling sound that carried an almost emotional quality. It was rare to see someone in that chair speak so plainly, so unguardedly. Sarah picked up from there, her tone soft but genuine. You've said before that your movies are about hope in dark places. Watching you talk now, it feels like that comes from a personal place. Keanu nodded slowly. I think we all go through loss and pain. The question is what we do with it. Some people run from it, some people bury it. For me, I try to turn it into something useful, something that helps someone else keep going. Sunny added, And that's what makes your work special. You're telling stories about people finding meaning again. That's universal. Keanu smiled. If anything I do can make someone feel a little less alone, then I've done my job. The audience began to applaud again, a standing ovation from a few in the back row. Even the floor manager, who was usually immune to the emotional swings of the show, wiped at his eyes discreetly. But while the others smiled, Joy Behar sat silently, her face composed, but her hand tapping against her stack of cue cards. The rhythmic motion was barely noticeable at first, a steady beat, like someone rehearsing patience. Her jaw tightened as she watched the audience's reaction. The warmth in the room was growing, and she wasn't part of it. Keanu's words filled the air like calm water, smoothing the edges of everything around him. He thanked the audience once more, nodding toward the woman who had written the fan letter, and then looked back at Whoopi. "I just feel lucky to be here," he said. "To share a story, to listen, to connect. That's all we can really do." Whoopi smiled broadly. "That's what we love about you. You remind us that kindness doesn't have to be loud to be powerful." The crowd cheered again. But behind that wave of applause, Joy's expression shifted ever so slightly. Her eyes lowered toward her cards. The red one on top had a single bold line scrawled across it in black ink. "Silence equals complicity." Her finger tapped the edge once more. The cameras were about to go to commercial. The applause sign flashed. Whoopi called for a short break. Joy didn't look up. She already knew the next segment wasn't going to be friendly. The applause sign dimmed, and the lights softened as the show returned from commercial. The audience quieted, their cheerful energy from before settling into a more focused anticipation. Whoopi Goldberg's voice carried smoothly as she transitioned the tone. "Welcome back. We're here with Keanu Reeves, talking about his incredible new film, The Guardian Redemption. But before we move on, I'd like to touch on something I think everyone can relate to: privacy in a digital age." Keanu nodded, leaning forward slightly. "It's something we all struggle with, I think. Everyone's so connected now that sometimes it feels like we're not allowed to have quiet anymore." The audience hummed in agreement, a few people clapping lightly. But before Whoopi could continue, another voice sliced through the air like a sudden gust of wind. "There's privacy," Joy Behar interrupted sharply, her tone quick and deliberate. "And then there's silence when it matters." The studio fell still. Even the sound of the air conditioning seemed to fade. The crane camera, sensing the tension, began its slow glide downward toward the table, capturing the moment in cinematic detail. Whoopi's hand twitched on her cue cards, but she didn't stop her co-host. Sunny Hostin glanced sideways, sensing something in Joy's expression that didn't look like casual banter. Sarah straightened in her seat. Alyssa folded her hands together and waited, uncertain whether to speak or stay silent. Joy's voice carried a sharpened edge, the kind she'd perfected after decades in live television. "You talk a lot about humility, Keanu," she said. "About doing good quietly. But don't you think that kind of silence can sometimes do more harm than good? That maybe silence on certain issues is, in itself, a privilege?" Keanu's posture didn't change. He looked at her with calm, steady eyes, his hands still relaxed in his lap. "I think there's a difference between being silent and being private," he said. "I try to live my values rather than perform them." A ripple of soft applause spread through the audience, hesitant at first, but growing. Joy didn't smile. "That sounds poetic," she said quickly. "But it's not an answer. People look up to you. You have this enormous platform, and yet you almost never use it to take a stand. Why not? What are you afraid of?" The room grew quieter still. Keanu inhaled slowly, steadying himself before answering. "I'm not afraid," he said. "I just believe actions speak louder than statements." Joy's words cut through the air like a cold wind. Silence isn't neutral. It enables harm. Her tone was sharper now, faster, the cadence of someone who'd spent years mastering confrontation for a live audience. The applause from before had evaporated. What replaced it was a silence so complete that even the faint hum of the cameras seemed intrusive. Sunny Hostin shifted in her chair, uncertain whether to step in or let the tension unfold. Whoopi glanced toward the control booth, a silent plea for direction, but the producers gave none. They knew what this was. They could feel it too, the kind of combustible moment that could make or break a show's ratings. Keanu didn't flinch. His posture stayed open, shoulders loose, eyes calm. His stillness seemed almost unnatural against Joy's growing intensity. He clasped his hands together and said quietly, "I don't believe silence is complicity. Sometimes silence is reflection. Sometimes it's listening. Sometimes it's letting others speak first." There was something in the softness of his delivery that disarmed even his critics. It wasn't defensive, it was human. But Joy didn't back down. "That's convenient," she replied, the sarcasm unmistakable. "It's easy to talk about listening when people are suffering. When the world is on fire, listening doesn't put it out." A few gasps came from the bitterest audience. The sound engineer instinctively lowered Joy's mic by a few decibels. Whoopi tried to step in. "Joy, I think what Keanu's saying is that we can't all contribute in the same way." But Joy pressed on. "No, Whoopi, I think people need to hear this. We keep giving these celebrities a free pass, to stay neutral, to play nice, to act like kindness is enough, but it's not. Not anymore." The audience began to murmur, an uneasy ripple moving through the rows. The control room director leaned toward his monitor. "Split screen it," he instructed, and the broadcast instantly divided. Joy's face, tense and pointed, on one side. Keanu's, composed and steady, on the other. Keanu's voice broke the silence again, low but firm. "I think kindness is where change begins. You can't build bridges by shouting across them." The audience applauded softly, but this time the sound was fragmented. Half approval, half apprehension. Joy crossed her arms, tapping her pen against her cue cards. The red one, with silence, equals complicity, gleamed beneath the studio lights. Keanu's calm response seemed to hang in the air longer than the producers expected. The camera lingered on his face, capturing the quiet gravity of his expression. His voice carried steady warmth, the kind that filled silence without dominating it. "We can disagree on how to make a difference," he said evenly. "But that doesn't mean one of us cares less. Sometimes, it just means we're walking different paths to the same place." Joy leaned forward, eyes sharp, seizing the moment. "So, what's your path then, Keanu? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks a lot like comfort. You get to make your movies, donate quietly, and walk away with your reputation untouchable. That's not bravery. That's insulation." The audience gasped, and even Whoopi's head turned sharply toward Joy. "Come on now," Whoopi murmured. But Joy didn't stop. She was in it fully now, her adrenaline pushing her words faster than her thoughts. Keanu didn't rush to respond. He let the weight of her accusation fill the space. Then, slowly, he said, "You think doing good quietly is comfort? You think choosing compassion without cameras is easy? I don't do what I do to protect myself. I do it because real change doesn't need applause to exist." The audience clapped again, louder this time, and a few people stood. Joy's face twitched, caught between defiance and realization. She wasn't used to her challenges being met with such calm resistance. Sunny Hostin tried to mediate her voice level. "I think maybe there's a balance to find here," she said. "Public figures do influence others. People listen when someone like you speaks. So how do you decide when to speak and when to stay silent?" Keanu nodded respectfully toward her. "It's about intention," he said. "If speaking helps others, then do it. If it's just to look righteous, maybe that's ego talking. The difference is motive." The crowd applauded again, this time more unified. The tension began to melt slightly, but Joy wasn't ready to let go. She lifted the red card from her stack and tapped it against the table. The black lettering was visible even to those in the front row. "Silence equals complicity." Her voice cut through once more. Intentions are fine, Keanu. But at the end of the day, silence helps the wrong side. You know that. Everyone knows that. The audience quieted again. The boom mic trembled slightly in the operator's hands. Keanu exhaled slowly. And accusation, he said softly, often helps no one. The pause that followed was electric long enough for everyone in the studio to feel the shift. The tension had turned into something else entirely. Awareness. Everyone knew the tone of the show had changed for good. The control room director whispered to his crew, "Keep rolling. Don't cut." On screen, the split image of calm and confrontation filled every living room watching. The storm had begun. The tension on the set had hardened into something palpable. The red card in Joy's hand gleamed under the stage lights, its words hovering in everyone's mind. Silence equals complicity. The audience waited for Keanu's response, their applause fading into an expectant hush. Sunny Hostin leaned forward, her tone measured but firm. "Joy raises an important point," she began. "There's a long history of public figures using their platforms to create awareness, to spark change. Think about people like Jane Fonda, Leonardo DiCaprio, or Robert Downey Jr. They speak out, and it moves the conversation forward. Don't you think people like you, Keanu, could do the same?" Keanu turned toward her, his expression thoughtful. "I understand that perspective," he said, "and I admire those who use their voices that way. But truth to power isn't a talk show slogan. It's not a performance or a soundbite. It's how you treat people when no one's watching." The line hit with quiet force. A few members of the audience began to clap, hesitant at first, then louder. Whoopi gave a small nod, recognizing the truth in his tone. Keanu continued, his voice calm but resonant. "Speaking out can be powerful, yes, but so can showing up without cameras, listening to people who never get heard, helping quietly without needing to prove it to the world. I don't need a hashtag to do what's right." The audience erupted again, this time with genuine applause. The sound bounced off the rafters, echoing into the control booth. A producer winced as the sound meters spiked into the red. Joy shifted in her seat, her jaw tightening. "But that's the thing, isn't it?" she said quickly, trying to regain control. "People can't follow your example if they don't see it. You talk about kindness, about helping quietly, but no one knows about it unless it's publicized. Isn't that a contradiction?" Keanu looked at her, his gaze steady. "Not everything good needs to be followed," he replied. "Sometimes it just needs to be done. People don't need another celebrity telling them how to live. They need examples of humility, not lectures." A wave of applause swept across the studio. The camera panned slowly over the audience rows of faces, nodding, emotional. Somewhere behind the cameras, the director whispered, "Keep it rolling. This is lightning in a bottle." Sunny hesitated, caught between her professional role and the sincerity in Keanu's words. "I think we can all agree humility is important," she said carefully. "But when you're someone millions listen to, staying silent can send the wrong message. Whether you like it or not, your voice carries weight." Keanu gave a slow nod. "It does," he admitted, "and that's why I'm careful with it. Because when you have that kind of influence, every word can divide as easily as it can unite. I don't want to add to the noise. I'd rather do something that lasts." His tone wasn't defensive, it was reflective. The kind of answer that didn't seek to win, only to clarify. The room seemed to lean in closer. He continued softly, "There are things I care deeply about: education, children's health, the environment. I give time, I give money, I give attention. But I don't post about it. I don't call a press conference. Because when I visit a school or a hospital, it's not about me. It's about them. I want those people to feel seen, not used." A low murmur ran through the audience, followed by spontaneous applause. Some of them stood again, clapping louder now. The energy of the room shifted, no longer tense, but emotional. Sarah Haynes smiled faintly, visibly moved. "That's the thing," she said quietly. "You talk about these things without trying to make them about yourself. That's rare." Joy Behar tapped her cue card again, trying to pull the focus back. But, Keanu, don't you think that's a little naive? She said. In this world, if it's not public, it doesn't move people. You can't inspire others by keeping everything private. Keanu met her gaze. Maybe not, he said. But maybe we've forgotten that the most powerful inspiration doesn't come from publicity, it comes from example. When a person sees someone do good quietly, it reminds them they can do it too, without waiting for approval. The studio broke into applause again, louder this time, and for a brief moment, Joy's face faltered. Her usual composure wavered as she realized she was losing the room. Whoopi looked between them, sensing the rising emotion. You know, she said softly, it's not often we have a guest who can turn a heated question into a moment of reflection. That's something. Keanu smiled faintly. Maybe that's what we need more of, reflection, not reaction. The applause lasted longer than the producers expected, spilling over the timing cue. The control booth scrambled to decide whether to cut to commercial, but the director shook his head. Let it breathe, he said. This is real. When the sound finally began to settle, Joy leaned forward again, unwilling to let the moment slip away. Her tone was composed, but beneath it, frustration trembled like static. Keanu, she began, you talk about unity and kindness, but the world is divided. People are scared, angry, fighting for basic rights. Don't you think staying neutral, staying silent just lets the people causing harm keep doing it? Keanu didn't answer immediately. He folded his hands in front of him, taking a slow breath. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but there was steel in it now, quiet conviction forged from something deeper than anger. I don't believe in neutrality when it comes to right and wrong, he said, but I do believe in humanity before headlines. You can't fix division by throwing more stones. You fix it by remembering we're still people. The audience clapped again, this time almost instinctively. Joy tried to interrupt, but he continued, his tone unwavering. Every day, people work 2 jobs, raise kids, care for sick parents. They don't have the luxury of turning their pain into a press release. They just live through it. So when I choose to speak, I want it to matter. I want it to help, not to perform. There was something raw in the way he said it, and the crowd responded. Some nodded, others murmured, that's right. The boom mic picked up the low chorus of agreement. Joy's hand tightened around her pen. So you're saying those of us who use our platforms are performing? She asked. Keanu met her gaze. I'm saying intention matters, he replied gently. If the goal is to bring light, then do it. But if the goal is to prove you're the brightest one in the room, maybe it's not light anymore, it's spotlight. That line drew a gasp, followed by another wave of applause. Even Whoopi lowered her head slightly, hiding a smile. Sarah leaned forward, voice quiet but sincere. You're talking about unity, aren't you? Keanu nodded. That's what art is supposed to do. Bring people together, not tear them apart. I make movies that a granddad and his granddaughter can enjoy in the same theater. That's what I believe, in connection over conflict. Alyssa smiled. That's rare these days. Keanu shrugged. Maybe, but I think people are tired of being told which side to stand on. Maybe what we need is a reminder that there's still a middle ground where respect lives, where compassion starts. The audience broke into thunderous applause. The control room's meters spiked again. One producer winced and muttered, "We're peaking." But no one cared. On the studio floor, Joy's cue cards lay still in her lap. The red one was slipping out of her stack. For the first time that morning, her hand wasn't tapping. The air inside the studio felt different now. The warmth that had filled the earlier segments had shifted into something electric, something alive. Everyone could feel it. The audience, the hosts, even the crew, trying to keep quiet behind the cameras. The tension wasn't hostility. It was anticipation, the uneasy stillness that comes when truth starts to collide with ego. Alyssa Farah Griffin leaned forward, her tone calm, attempting to bridge the widening gap. I think maybe we're losing sight of something, she said carefully. There are many ways to help, right? Some people are loud, others quiet, but both can matter. The goal should be the same. The relief in the room was subtle, but immediate. Alyssa's voice had a way of easing friction. The audience exhaled. Whoopi gave a small, approving nod. Even Keanu turned slightly toward her with gratitude in his eyes. But Joy wasn't ready to yield. She tapped her pen once, twice, then spoke with that clipped rhythm that made every word land like a drumbeat. "That's what people always say," she countered. "It's the line they use to dodge responsibility, to stay safe. When you're in a position of power and you choose quiet charity over public stance, you're choosing comfort over courage." A hush swept across the studio again. Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, voice level but firm.
"What risk, Joy?" he asked softly.
"Tell me, what risk are you taking when your audience already agrees with you? When your sponsors already support what you say? When your show rewards confrontation because it trends online? That's not risk. That's reinforcement." The words landed like a slow-moving wave, spreading through the audience row by row. A few people gasped. Others began clapping instinctively, unsure if they should. Joy blinked, caught off guard for a fraction of a second, before straightening again. "So you think using your platform to challenge injustice is about trending?" she said, her tone incredulous. Keanu's reply came with calm precision. "I think using someone's good name as a prop for confrontation is," he said, "and that's not journalism, it's theater." The applause this time was full, unprompted, rising from every corner of the studio. A producer watching from the control booth whispered into his headset, "Levels are peaking again." Whoopi glanced at the floor manager, who gestured for her to cut the conversation short. But she didn't. She let it breathe. Whoopi's decision to let the moment run changed everything. You could almost hear the collective heartbeat of the audience as Keanu's last words settled into the air. The cameras shifted slightly to catch his expression, the calm that came from conviction, not defiance. Joy Behar adjusted her papers, trying to reclaim her rhythm, but her timing was off now. She glanced toward Sonny Hostin for reinforcement, and Sonny, ever the professional, stepped in. "I think there's truth in both perspectives," Sonny said. "But what Joy's getting at is that visibility matters. When people see celebrities take a stand, it sends a message. It normalizes activism, makes others braver. Don't you think silence sometimes looks like indifference?" Keanu turned toward her, his eyes steady, his tone kind. "I think silence can look like many things. Reflection, listening, healing, sometimes even grace. We assume every quiet person is uncaring, but sometimes they're doing more good than the loudest voices. You just don't see it." The audience clapped softly, a mix of understanding and awe. The authenticity in his tone pulled them closer. Joy pounced on the pause. "But that's the point," she pressed. "If we don't see it, how do we know it's real? Anyone can claim they're doing good behind closed doors. Where's the accountability?" Keanu nodded slightly, acknowledging the question. "Accountability," he repeated thoughtfully. "That's a fair word, but I think we confuse accountability with performance. I'm accountable to the people I help, not to the people watching. If a sick child gets medicine, if a struggling student gets to finish school, that's the result that matters, not whether I posted it online." His tone wasn't defensive. It was simple, direct, and utterly sincere. The power of it lay in its calmness. The crowd applauded again, louder now, clapping through Joy's next attempt to speak. She waited for it to die down, but the sound only grew stronger. Alyssa smiled faintly, whispering, "They're with him." Whoopi's gaze darted toward the clock in the studio. They were over time, but cutting now felt impossible. She glanced at the floor manager again. The man raised his hand, signaling to move on. Whoopi shook her head. "Not yet." The control room erupted in chatter. One producer shouted, "We're live, just write it." The director leaned in toward his mic. "Stay on camera 3, he ordered. "Don't look away. The audience needs to see this." The spotlight stayed on Keanu. The world outside that studio had gone silent. The tension had reached its peak. But Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm presence alone filled the room, anchoring everyone in a silence that demanded attention. The red card in Joy's hand lay face down on the table now, as though the words had lost their power. The audience leaned forward, caught between admiration and disbelief at what they were witnessing. Keanu's voice carried again, steady and reflective. "The truth is, I don't think compassion should need an audience to count," he said. "If I give quietly, it's because the people I help deserve privacy, not pity. Their stories aren't mine to use. When I see a child smile because they finally got what they need, I don't reach for a camera, I reach for perspective. That's where meaning lives." Applause rippled again, this time softer, but more emotional. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. Even through the bright stage lights, you could see that Keanu's words were striking something deeper than entertainment. Joy crossed her arms, her tone clipped, but faltering. "But Keanu, people need visible examples. Otherwise, the world stays the same. Maybe some people need to see you care before they start caring themselves." He looked at her kindly, almost sadly. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe they just need someone to remind them that being good isn't about being seen. It's about doing the right thing when nobody's watching." That line broke the audience's restraint. Applause roared through the studio, long and thunderous. A few people stood, clapping, until the soundboard lights flared into the red again. Whoopi looked from Joy to Keanu, her expression a mix of respect and unease. "You've got them thinking," she said softly. "I hope so," he replied, "because that's what conversation should do. It shouldn't be about cornering people, it should be about understanding." Sunny, now quieter, looked down at her notes. "I can't argue with that," she said, her voice subdued. "That's actually beautiful." Joy sat back, exhaling sharply through her nose. "It's poetic, sure, but words like that don't change laws, don't stop injustice." Keanu nodded slowly. "You're right, they don't, but they can change people. And sometimes, that's where justice begins." Alyssa leaned forward again. "Maybe that's what we're missing," she said. "We talk so much about changing systems, but we forget systems are made of people," the crowd murmured in agreement. Whoopi smiled faintly, lifting her hand toward the audience. "That's why we do this show," she said, "to have moments that make us think, whether we agree or not." As applause filled the studio again, the camera zoomed, slowly on Keanu's face, serene, reflective, quietly unshaken. Then, as the control room whispered for transition, a banner slid across the bottom of the broadcast screen for viewers at home. "Do you think private charity can be more powerful than public activism? Comment yes or no and tell us why." The question echoed in living rooms everywhere. The applause died down slowly, leaving the studio bathed in a strange quiet. Even the lights seemed softer now, the buzzing tension giving way to something raw, something real. Keanu sat forward slightly, elbows on his knees, eyes distant, as if he were no longer talking to the hosts or the cameras, but to the version of himself who had once stood at the very bottom. "I wasn't born into this life," he began softly. "I started washing dishes in a small diner off Yonge Street. I used to sleep on friends' couches, sometimes in my car, sometimes wherever a roof would let me rest. My biggest dream wasn't fame, it was stability, a warm place, a steady meal." The audience grew completely silent. Every sentence carried weight, drawn from memory, not performance. "I remember working as a stagehand once, moving lights for another actor's show," he continued. "The crew ate last, worked longest, and no one knew their names, but they showed up every morning. They kept the lights burning so others could shine. I learned more about humanity from those people than from any script." He looked up at the crowd. "That's why I treat every crew member with the same respect I give a director, because I've been there. I've been the person who's invisible until something goes wrong." Whoopi's face softened. She looked almost proud. Alyssa nodded quietly. Sarah's eyes glistened, her lips parting slightly, as if to say something, then closing again. Keanu went on, his voice calm but unwavering. "I'm grateful every day that people choose to watch what I make. They don't owe me that. They spend their hard-earned money to see a story, to feel something, to escape for a while. I never forget that." He paused, and then his tone deepened. "And because of that, I refuse to weaponize my art. I won't turn it into a platform to divide people. I won't insult the people who support my work by telling them how to think." A murmur ran through the Balaun crowd, followed by thunderous applause that rolled like a wave across the studio. Even the warm-up comic, standing off stage with his cue card that read APPLOS, lowered it slowly. He didn't need to signal anyone. The moment was alive on its own. Joy Behar sat motionless. No smile, no reaction, just the steady gaze of someone who realized the tide had turned. Keanu waited until the applause faded before speaking again. When he did, his tone carried a quiet steadiness that felt like a heartbeat guiding the room. "You know," he said, "when people ask what keeps me grounded, I tell them it's the small things. The crew member who offers me water before a take. The driver who waits an extra hour when the shoot runs late. The nurse who smiles when I visit the hospital wards. These are the people who make the world go around. Not the headlines, not the fame, but the hands that do the work no one sees." Sarah shifted in her chair, visibly moved. The studio cameras caught her eyes glistening as Keanu continued. "When I was younger, I used to think success meant proving myself. Now I know it means remembering where I came from and who helped me get here. Gratitude isn't a brand, it's a responsibility." Alyssa nodded gently. "That's something people forget," she said. Keanu smiled faintly. "It's easy to forget, especially when you're surrounded by noise. Everyone's telling you what you should care about, what you should post, what you should condemn. But life isn't lived online. It's lived in the choices you make when nobody's watching." The crowd murmured again, low and thoughtful. He had managed to make a live talk show feel like a quiet conversation around a campfire. Sonny Hostin looked uneasy. "But don't you think some issues require a louder voice? That silence can sometimes be taken as indifference?" Keanu turned toward her. "If you're doing nothing, then silence is dangerous," he said. "But if you're doing the work, if you're helping, if you're showing up for people, then silence is just humility. There's a difference between not caring and not performing." That distinction hung heavy in the air. The audience broke into applause again, longer this time. Whoopi leaned slightly toward him. "You're making a lot of sense, Keanu," she said quietly. "That's not something we hear every day on this stage." He smiled again, almost self-conscious. "Maybe it's not about making sense. Maybe it's about making space for respect, for listening, for grace." That final word, grace, seemed to echo, settling over the studio like a benediction. The camera zoomed slowly, capturing the stillness in every face. No one moved. No one dared interrupt. The silence that followed was profound. No cue cards, no teleprompter, no rehearsed applause, just an audience sitting in awe of a man who spoke like every word came from a place of hard-earned truth. Keanu sat back slightly, his hands folded in his lap, the calm center of a storm that had turned into revelation. He looked toward the audience, his voice low but carrying. "I grew up watching my mother clean houses," he said. "She used to come home with her hands cracked from soap and bleach. I remember asking her why she never complained. She'd say, 'Because work is work, and kindness is free.' Those words never left me. They remind me every day that respect isn't about status, it's about how you treat people when no one's there to applaud." The camera panned across the studio, catching faces streaked with tears. The applause that came next wasn't loud. It was slow, deliberate, the kind that meant understanding rather than excitement. Keanu continued, his tone unwavering. "People think being in Hollywood changes you. It can, if you let it. But I learned early that if you start believing you're above anyone, you've already lost what makes you human. I don't ever want to forget that. Not in the way I act, not in the way I live, and definitely not in the way I use my voice." Joy Behar finally broke her stillness, her expression unreadable. "So you're saying you don't feel any responsibility to lead?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost testing. Keanu's eyes met hers, not combative but resolute. "I think leadership looks different for everyone. For me, it's about example. If I can make people kinder to each other by being kind myself, if I can make a stranger smile by showing respect, that's leadership." "You don't always need a microphone to make a difference." The audience erupted again. A woman in the back shouted, "That's what real leadership is." The energy filled the studio like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Sarah Haynes leaned closer, her voice trembling slightly. "You know, I've interviewed hundreds of guests," she said, "but I've never seen anyone turn a confrontation into something this honest." Keanu smiled gently. "I don't think of it as confrontation," he replied. "I think of it as clarity. We forget sometimes that truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to stand." That line drew one of the strongest reactions yet. The crowd rose to their feet in a standing ovation, clapping, cheering, some even whistling. The sound was overwhelming, but Keanu didn't bask in it. He simply bowed his head slightly, grateful but humble. On the far side of the stage, the warm-up comic lowered his cue card again, smiling to himself. For once, he didn't have to remind anyone to applaud. Even Joy Behar, who sat rigidly in her chair, seemed unsure whether to argue or absorb what had just happened. The lights glowed softer, the applause thundered. And for a moment, everyone in that studio was united in something far greater than a talk show. Truth spoken without anger, conviction without ego, and humility that silenced everything else. The studio had become so still that the hum of the lights seemed to echo. Joy Behar sat motionless, her pen hovering over her notes. For several seconds, the silence was almost reverent, until it wasn't. The applause faded, replaced by something sharper. Pride, frustration, fear of losing control. Joy leaned forward, her voice low but trembling with anger. "You're scared," she said. The words cut through the quiet like glass. "That's what this is. You hide behind humility because you're terrified to be challenged. You're afraid of saying something wrong, afraid of losing your perfect image." The audience reacted with a collective gasp. The tension snapped back like a stretched wire. Even the camera operators froze, their lenses fixed. Whoopi turned toward Joy, eyes wide. But before she could speak, Keanu slowly rose from his chair. He didn't move quickly or defensively. He simply stood, tall and calm, his hands relaxed at his sides. The audience fell completely silent again. The contrast was almost cinematic, her voice shaking, his steady presence absorbing the noise. "I'm not scared," he said quietly. The simplicity of it carried more force than a shout ever could. "I'm disappointed." Those words hit harder than any retort. The boom mic caught the faint sound of someone in the front row whispering, "Oh my God." Joy blinked rapidly, trying to recover her composure. "Disappointed?" she echoed, as if the word itself offended her. Keanu nodded slowly. Disappointed that a conversation that could have been meaningful turned into a spectacle. Disappointed that a platform built on discussion has become a stage for division. And disappointed that we forgot what respect feels like. A murmur rippled through the audience. Someone began to clap, and others followed. The sound hesitant at first, then swelling until the studio filled with it again. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. He reached up to the small microphone, clipped to his sweater. The sound tech in the control room whispered, "He's taking off his mic," as if watching something historic. Keanu unhooked the clasp, holding it gently in his hand. "I came here in good faith," he said. "But if the only way to stay in this conversation is to abandon honesty, then I'll step out of it instead." He placed the microphone softly on the arm of his chair, an act so small yet so heavy with meaning that the audience collectively held its breath. The soft click of the microphone against the chair was the loudest sound in the room. That single gesture, so calm, so deliberate, seemed to carry the weight of every unsaid truth in the air. The red recording light above the cameras glowed brighter, almost unnaturally, as if the studio itself was holding its breath. Keanu remained standing, his expression composed. "You know what disappoints me most?" he said quietly, his voice steady enough that the microphones hanging above caught every syllable. It's that we've reached a point where disagreement feels like disrespect, where asking for understanding sounds like retreat. Whoopi leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but urgent. Keanu, maybe we can take a step back here. I think what Joy meant. He turned toward her with a calm, almost gentle nod. I know what she meant, he said. And I respect the right to ask difficult questions. But respect should go both ways. Joy opened her mouth, but no words came. Her fingers tightened around her note cards. Her usual confidence faltered for the first time that morning. The audience watched in silence, transfixed. Keanu looked around the room at the cameras, the lights, the faces staring back at him. I don't mind being challenged, he said. I've lived through harder things than a television debate. I've lost friends. I've worked jobs that broke my body. I've survived loneliness, rejection, and a world that doesn't always reward decency. I'm not afraid of a question. He paused, and the moment stretched. But I am disappointed when questions stop being about understanding and start being about proving someone wrong. That's not dialogue. That's theater. The control booth remained frozen. The director whispered, "Keep rolling. Don't you dare cut." The camera zoomed closer, catching the quiet emotion flickering behind Keanu's eyes. He wasn't angry. He wasn't hurt. He looked like a man who had simply reached his limit with pretense. Whoopi spoke again, softly, almost pleading. We don't want this to end badly, Keanu. This show, it's supposed to be a space for open talk. Keanu turned his head toward her, his voice still calm. Then let's be honest. This isn't about open talk. It's about control. But don't worry, he said gently. We understand each other perfectly. The words landed like a closing door. Even the air conditioner's hum seemed to stop. Whoopi sat back slowly, realizing there was nothing more to say. For a long moment, no one dared to move. Keanu stood still, his presence filling the space with quiet authority. The light from the overhead rigs caught a faint shimmer in his eyes, though whether it was frustration or sorrow, no one could tell. Behind him, a stagehand stepped forward instinctively, then froze, unwilling to break the moment. Joy Behar tried to speak again, but her voice wavered. You're walking away from accountability, she said. You came here to be praised, not questioned. Keanu turned slightly, meeting her gaze not with anger, but with an almost heartbreaking calm. No, Joy, he said. I came here to share, to have a real conversation. But when that becomes an ambush, it's not accountability, it's humiliation. And I won't take part in that. The audience murmured in agreement, low but audible. The tension that had once favored Joy now hung entirely in Keanu's favor. Every camera tightened its frame, following his every movement as if the crew knew this would be replayed for years to come. He took a small step forward, his hands still relaxed at his sides. The truth is, I don't blame you, he continued. I think we've all forgotten how to listen, how to talk without turning it into a battle. I just wish we remembered that sometimes silence isn't surrender, it's peace. That line struck like thunder. The crowd applauded again, some standing, others wiping at their eyes. Whoopi looked down at her cue sheet, knowing the show had gone completely off the rails, but also knowing she was witnessing something too rare to interrupt. Keanu glanced toward her, offering a small nod of respect. You've been fair, Whoopi. Thank you. Whoopi's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. There was nothing left to add that could match the gravity of the moment. He turned back to Joy, his voice now softer, almost sympathetic. I don't think you're my enemy. I think you care deeply. But caring doesn't mean controlling. You can't demand people express their goodness your way and then call it virtue. Joy sat back, her face pale. The audience gasped again, not because his words were cruel, but because they were undeniable. Then, almost tenderly, Keanu gestured toward the table, toward the untouched coffee mugs and scattered cue cards. I came here with good intentions. I came because I still believe in conversation, in kindness, in grace. But not like this. He took a slow breath, unclipped the small transmitter from his belt, and set it beside the microphone he'd already placed on the chair arm. Then he looked directly into camera one. We don't need to shout to be heard. We just need to mean what we say." He turned, gave the audience a small bow of thanks, and began walking off stage. As he passed, every person in the studio crew, audience, even producers rose instinctively to their feet. The applause was thunderous, echoing long after he disappeared behind the curtain. Keanu paused before leaving the stage, his steps measured, his breathing calm. The room seemed to shrink around him, lights dimming in memory even as they still burned. Every camera tracked his movement, every face frozen between disbelief and awe. He turned once more not toward the hosts, but toward the audience at home. "Before I go," he said softly, his voice steady through the boom mic still hanging above, "I want to speak to the people watching this from their living rooms. The teachers getting ready for another long day with too few supplies and too many students. The nurses who stay after their shifts because someone's family couldn't make it. The mechanics who fix a stranger's car just to keep them safe on the road. The parents trying to raise good kids in a world that sometimes forgets what good even means." The crowd listened in absolute stillness. His tone carried no bitterness, only compassion. "You don't have cameras on you," he said. "You don't get applause for what you do, but you still show up. You still care. You still do the right thing. That's real courage." Someone in the front row began to cry. Another person whispered, "Amen." Keanu's eyes softened. "You're the reason people like me even have a career. You're the reason the stories I tell matter. Because you remind us what integrity looks like when no one's watching. You don't need to prove your goodness, you just live it." The camera panned toward the microphone resting on the arm of his chair, the small metal clip catching a sliver of stage light. It sat there like a symbol, quiet, simple, final. Keanu's gaze lingered on it for a moment. "That right there," he said, nodding slightly. "That's what I believe in. Choosing silence when the noise stops meaning anything. Because real charity doesn't need an audience." The audience rose in another spontaneous standing ovation. The control booth went silent. The floor manager looked to Whoopi, waiting for a cue, but she didn't give one. She just watched. Keanu looked back toward the panel at Sunny, conflicted. At Sarah, whose eyes glistened. At Alyssa, nodding slowly. At Whoopi, sorrowful but respectful. Then his gaze reached Joy. There was no anger there, only pity, and something else, sadness for what she'd become. He gave her a small nod. "I hope someday we both find what we've lost." Then he turned and began to walk. The studio was utterly still, except for the sound of Keanu's footsteps. Each step felt deliberate, echoing softly against the polished floor. He didn't hurry, didn't look back for validation. Every movement carried a kind of grace that couldn't be rehearsed, a calm defiance born of conviction, not pride. As he approached the curtain, a stagehand instinctively stepped forward to open it. The young man froze for a moment, realizing who he was standing before. Keanu gave him a reassuring smile, a small nod that said, "It's okay." The stagehand swallowed hard, pushed the curtain aside, and whispered, "Thank you, sir." Keanu replied just loud enough for the boom mic to catch it. "No," he said. "Thank you for keeping this place running." The audience heard it, and another ripple of applause spread across the room. The moment felt more human than anything the show had ever aired. Behind the desk, the co-hosts remained frozen. Alyssa's eyes followed him as he walked away, her expression thoughtful. Sarah wiped her cheek discreetly, trying to regain her composure. Sunny looked down at her hands, guilt flickering across her face. Whoopi sat quietly, her jaw tight, as though she wanted to stop him but couldn't find the right words. And Joy Behar, once the loudest voice in the room, said nothing. Her cue cards were still in her hand, edges bent and damp where her fingers had pressed too tightly. The confidence that had carried her through thousands of shows was gone, replaced by a look of dawning realization. The applause wasn't for her. It had never been. Keanu reached the edge of the stage, the light haloing his figure from behind. He stopped briefly, turning to glance at the microphone still resting on the arm of the chair. The cameras instinctively followed his gaze. In that image, the empty seat, the silent mic, the standing man, There was more truth than 1,000 scripted interviews could hold. The audience knew it. The crew knew it. The hosts knew it. Keanu exhaled softly. "We all want to make a difference," he said, almost to himself. "But maybe it starts with listening instead of shouting. Maybe that's where it begins again." He turned once more toward the curtain. For a split second before disappearing backstage, he glanced back at the crowd, a small, grateful smile playing on his face. Then, he was gone. The moment Keanu vanished behind the curtain, the studio seemed to lose its balance. For a second, no one knew what to do. The cameras lingered on the empty chair, the mic still glinting faintly in the light. It was as if the air itself refused to move. Then chaos broke loose. In the control room, voices overlapped. "Cut to commercial," one producer shouted. Another yelled, "Stay live, don't lose the feed." The director hesitated. Every instinct said to preserve the moment, but the network demanded control. The feed snapped abruptly to black, then to an ad for a detergent brand. On the studio floor, the applause continued long after the cameras stopped rolling. The audience didn't care about the commercials. They'd just seen something unfiltered, something real, and they weren't ready to return to ordinary television. Behind the desk, Whoopi finally broke the silence. "That," she said quietly, "wasn't supposed to happen." Her voice trembled not with anger, but awe. Sarah exhaled shakily. "Maybe it was," she said. Joy sat completely still. The cue cards she had clutched so tightly now lay scattered. Across the table, one flipped over, the ink smudged where her thumb had pressed too hard. Her eyes were fixed on the curtain where Keanu had disappeared. Backstage, Keanu kept walking, past the bright signs, past the startled producers trying to speak to him. He didn't respond. He stepped out a side door into the crisp autumn air, the sound of applause still faintly echoing behind him. He pulled his jacket tighter and whispered to himself, "Real charity doesn't need an audience." Outside, the world continued: traffic, noise, life. But inside that studio, something had changed forever. It started within minutes. The clip of Keanu walking off the View hit the internet before the studio lights had even cooled. A producer's assistant, still shaking from the tension, posted a short vertical video on her lunch break. Within an hour, it had been re-uploaded thousands of times, cropped, captioned, stitched, and shared across every major platform. On TikTok, the video spread like wildfire. Overlays of text flashed across the screen. "When class meets chaos, Keanu just taught the world a masterclass in grace." The hashtags multiplied by the second number: "Stand with Keanu," number "Respect over performance," number "Let actions speak." Twitter, Facebook, YouTube Shorts, all flooded with the same 30-second moment. Keanu standing tall, saying quietly, "I'm not scared, I'm disappointed." Then came the testimonies. One of his co-stars, actress Victoria Chen, tweeted, "I've worked with Keanu on 3 films. He never once raised his voice, never once complained. When my mother was sick, he sent flowers quietly, no card. That's who he is." The post hit 2 million likes in hours. A lighting technician from an old movie posted a photo of a note Keanu had written him years ago. It said simply, "Thanks for keeping the light right." Underneath, he captioned, "He remembered my name when no one else did." Then the ordinary people joined in. A teacher shared that her classroom had received laptops from an anonymous donor years ago, only now realizing it was his foundation. A nurse described him visiting a pediatric ward at 2 a.m., sitting with children until sunrise, and leaving without a single photo. A college student posted her scholarship letter funded by the Reeves Trust, signed only with a simple KR. Every story painted the same picture: kindness without cameras, generosity without hashtags, humanity without spectacle. As the posts surged, the network scrambled. Talk shows scheduled emergency meetings. Commentators began choosing sides, some defending Joy Behar's right to challenge, others calling it a public ambush. CNN aired a split screen of the confrontation, labeling it accountability or attack. Meanwhile, Keanu said nothing. He didn't issue a statement. He didn't tweet. He didn't even appear in public. The silence only amplified his message. In millions of homes, Screens replayed his quiet defiance over and over, and somewhere beneath the trending noise, a question began to spread, one that would soon dominate every comment section and headline. Whose approach do you respect more? Loud advocacy or quiet action? Share a story from your life. By the afternoon, the internet had become a living storm. The video was everywhere, on phones, in cafes, on television screens at airports. It had reached every corner of digital life. Hashtags that began as fan reactions were now turning into a full-fledged movement. Comment threads overflowed with emotion, debate, and personal confessions. People began to share stories of their own quiet heroes. A single mother wrote about a stranger who paid for her groceries and left before she could say thank you. A veteran posted that Keanu's words reminded him of a medic who risked everything in silence, never asking for praise. A high school student shared a photo of her late father with the caption, "He taught me that being good doesn't need witnesses." Today, Keanu said the same thing. It was no longer about celebrity. It was about humanity. News outlets could barely keep up. One network host described it as, "The moment humility became revolutionary." Another compared it to a digital moral reset. Clips of Joy Behar's expression, frozen mid-retort, became memes overnight. But even the humor carried weight. People weren't mocking, they were awakening. Behind the scenes, corporate executives began to panic. Advertising partners called ABC, demanding explanations. Brands pulled their scheduled commercials from upcoming episodes. Internal memos leaked by morning. Brand safety concern due to guest incident. The phrase repeated across emails that quickly found their way online. PR analysts called it the View's most costly 3 minutes in history. Meanwhile, Keanu's co-stars and colleagues continued to speak up. Actor James Rodriguez posted a video from his trailer. "I've worked with the man for 15 years, he said. He treats the janitor the same way he treats the director. That's not a media strategy, that's his soul." The comment section exploded with gratitude, validation, and unity. People from opposite political spectrums rarely agreeing on anything found common ground under the same hashtags. For one brief day, the internet wasn't divided by outrage but united by decency. News anchors read tweets on air. Radio hosts quoted his lines. Even international outlets translated the segment into multiple languages, dubbing it the Keanu moment. But the most viral clip wasn't the confrontation, it was his walk away. The camera angle caught the microphone glinting on the chair, the empty space where he'd stood, and his final words echoing like a prayer across the internet. Real charity doesn't need an audience. By evening, the numbers were staggering. 50 million views, 22 trending hashtags, comment sections filled with essays, tears, and reflections. Celebrities posted tributes, but it was the ordinary people whose voices defined the movement. A nurse wrote, "He reminded us that compassion isn't a headline, it's a habit." A factory worker shared, "I don't have followers, but I help when I can. Guess that counts." A pastor simply wrote, "Grace walked off that stage today." News programs debated whether Keanu's silence was a strategy or a statement. It didn't matter. The world had already decided. His refusal to engage became the loudest message of all. Across social media, people tagged their acts of kindness under number "Let Actions Speak." Meals were paid forward. Donations poured into children's hospitals. Small businesses pledged to do one quiet good thing a day. ABC released a statement calling the incident a misunderstanding. It was too late. Screens across the world replayed the same frame. Keanu Reeves walking away not in anger, not in victory, but in peace. And as millions shared that clip, one truth cut through the noise. Humility had gone viral, and the world was ready to listen. By the next morning, every newsroom in America was spinning. The clip of Keanu walking off The View had become the most watched daytime television moment of the year. Overnight, it had shifted from entertainment to cultural event. And as the world dissected every word, every look, every pause, the people behind the show were already scrambling. ABC's PR department moved first. They needed a response before the morning headlines framed the narrative without them. Joy Behar's publicist drafted a statement edited by network lawyers, rewritten 3 times to strike the balance between defense and damage control. By noon, it was released. "I have tremendous respect for Keanu Reeves and his body of work," the statement read. Our exchange was intended to open an important discussion about celebrity responsibility and advocacy. If my approach made him uncomfortable, that was never my intention. I believe honest conversations are necessary, even when they're difficult. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Social media exploded again. Thousands of comments poured in within minutes. "That's not accountability," one user wrote. "That's spin." Another replied, "If my approach made him uncomfortable, you humiliated him on live TV. Own it." Screenshots of Joy's expression during the segment were posted side by side with her apology. Underneath, captions read, "Still no self-awareness." Commentators on morning radio shows mocked the phrasing. Late-night hosts read the statement aloud, their audiences groaning at the familiar PR cadence. Memes flooded the internet. The non-apology tour. "If I hurt your feelings, but I don't think I did." Even news anchors couldn't resist subtle digs. But the sharpest blow came from the people who had once defended Joy's approach, the fans who saw her as a truth teller. They turned too. "You can't preach accountability and then dodge it," one wrote. "If Keanu can own kindness, you can own a mistake." It was no longer about ratings or politics. It had become a referendum on sincerity. And sincerity, it seemed, was the one thing Joy's statement lacked. Inside ABC headquarters, the atmosphere was electric with anxiety. Executives crowded into a glass-walled conference room, the blinds hastily drawn. Someone had printed out a dozen trending screenshots, each one a fresh wound. He walked. The world stood. Integrity doesn't need a studio. Another image showed a graph, the rating spike from the episode in red. A vertical tower, but beside it, a smaller, more damning chart showed a collapse in trust metrics. Viewers weren't tuning in for admiration. They were tuning in for outrage. "We've got the numbers," said the head of analytics, sliding a report forward. "Viewership tripled yesterday, but sentiment is down 48%. They're watching, but they're angry." A producer sighed, rubbing her forehead. "We broke the internet and our reputation with it." The senior vice president leaned forward. "Damage control. What's the fix?" Someone muttered. "Format adjustments." Another added, "Book softer guests for a while." "Too late for that," came a voice from the back. "This isn't about guests. It's about tone. People don't trust us anymore. They think we staged a public ambush." A heavy silence followed. The truth hung in the room like humidity too thick to ignore. One younger producer, nervous but brave, spoke up. "You know what people are calling it online?" No one answered. "They're calling it the moment authenticity won. They think we lost because we made television, and he made history." The words sank deep. The executives exchanged looks. Nobody argued. Meanwhile, newsroom monitors flashed headline montages. On CNN, the ambush that backfired. On Fox, the actor who refused to play along. On BBC, Hollywood's gentleman turns the tables. Joy watched the coverage alone in her dressing room, phone buzzing non-stop. The publicist's statement hadn't helped. It had made things worse. She scrolled through comments, each one sharper than the last. Her reflection in the mirror looked tired, older than usual. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure if she could talk her way out of this. She put the phone down and whispered under her breath, "What have I done?" Outside the dressing room, staff whispered too. Some said she'd crossed a line. Others said she'd just reminded people why they'd stopped watching. But everyone agreed on one thing: Keanu Reeves had changed the conversation forever. By the end of the week, the fallout was undeniable. Advertisers began quietly withdrawing their campaigns. 2 major sponsors paused all upcoming airings, citing brand alignment concerns. ABC issued a follow-up statement promising format review and tone recalibration, but the words sounded as hollow as Joy's apology. Meanwhile, the headlines kept multiplying. He walked, the world stood. Reeves redefines integrity in Hollywood, when silence spoke louder than spin. Each new article made the show's damage more irreversible. Online, media critics debated the deeper issue was this, about politics or something bigger. One essay on The Atlantic called it a mirror held to modern discourse. Another, trending on Medium, titled simply Performance activism versus principled privacy asked, have we forgotten how to respect those who simply choose to live their values instead of broadcasting them? The irony was painful. Ratings had never been higher, but loyalty had never been lower. Viewers weren't tuning in for connection anymore. They were watching for fallout. Trust had become collateral damage in the pursuit of attention. Inside the ABC control room, a technician muttered as he watched the day's rerun replay. The screen froze on Keanu's final moment, his hand gently placing the microphone on the chair. "That's it," the tech whispered. "That's the picture people are going to remember." And he was right. Across the country, millions of viewers saw that same image and understood what it meant. The man had walked away, but his truth had stayed behind. In the days that followed, the noise never stopped. Headlines kept multiplying. Commentators argued on podcasts, late-night hosts replayed the clip with awe, and fans filled every corner of the internet with praise and debate. But amid the digital uproar, Keanu Reeves was nowhere to be found. No statements, no interviews, no follow-up appearances. His official pages stayed blank. The man at the center of the storm had simply stepped out of it. On Monday morning, while entertainment networks scrambled for sound bites, Keanu's calendar carried on exactly as it had before. His assistant quietly confirmed his appointments: a hospital visit in downtown Los Angeles, a local library reading for children, and an evening call with the board of his charitable foundation. The schedule had been arranged weeks earlier, nothing had changed. That afternoon, a paparazzi photo surfaced online. Keanu was walking out of the hospital, wearing a plain black jacket and jeans, a bag of books and puzzles in one hand. He wasn't hiding, just existing. The caption under the image read, "No comment." No entourage, just a man with gifts. A reporter shouted his name from across the parking lot, asking if he had anything to say about the interviews seen around the world. Keanu smiled politely, raised a hand in quiet acknowledgement, and kept walking. The gesture wasn't dismissive, it was peaceful, final. By evening, his publicist's phone was buried under offers. Every major network wanted an exclusive. "He declines," was the only reply she gave. When a producer asked if he might reconsider later, she said simply, "You don't understand him." Silence is his answer. That night, the newsroom debate shows turned to speculation. "Is his silence humility or strategy?" one anchor asked. Another replied, "Maybe it's just what decency looks like." Meanwhile, somewhere far from the chatter, Keanu was already preparing for his next quiet act of kindness. The next morning, the Desperia Pravum world still buzzed, but Keanu's routine stayed quiet. While entertainment pundits speculated about his motives, he spent the early hours in a children's hospital. Nurses smiled when they saw him arrive, carrying a box filled with puzzles, crayons, and tiny action figures. He greeted each child by name, remembering faces from visits months before. When parents tried to thank him, he simply shook his head. "You're the real heroes," he said softly. A volunteer tried to take a photo, but Keanu raised a hand gently. "Let's just be here," he said. The moment stayed private, no selfies, no press. Only the memory of his calm presence lingered after he left. From there, he went to a small public library in Pasadena, where children gathered for an afternoon reading. He read a picture book about kindness, his voice steady and warm. When a young girl asked if he was the man on TV who got yelled at, he smiled. "Maybe," he said with a shrug, "but I like stories better than arguments." The room laughed softly, and the tension of the outside world melted away. That evening, his publicist's inbox overflowed. Offers came in from every direction: exclusive interviews, morning shows, late-night specials, even global networks, promising total creative control. Each request ended the same way: "He declines." A tabloid photographer caught a single candid shot of him leaving the library, still carrying the bag of books. The image went viral again, not because he looked glamorous, but because he didn't. Just a man in a plain black jacket, walking down an ordinary street, no entourage, no smile for the camera. The caption read, "The most powerful man in Hollywood refuses to play Hollywood." Online, people began calling it the week of silence. But to Keanu, it wasn't silence, it was life. While others argued about his intentions, he simply returned to his work, proving in his own quiet way that meaning doesn't need a microphone. As the week drew to a close, a single message appeared in Keanu's foundation inbox. It wasn't from a journalist or a fan seeking an autograph. It was from a mother in Ohio. Her note was short, written late at night, the kind of message sent by someone unsure if anyone would ever read it. "I don't want this shared," it began. "But my husband lost his job last year, and our daughter needed therapy we couldn't afford. Somehow, someone covered the full cost. The clinic said it was anonymous. We just learned it was your foundation. Please don't ever say our names. We just wanted to say thank you." Keanu's assistant printed the letter and handed it to him quietly during their morning meeting. He read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. "That's the only headline I need," he said, smiling faintly. That evening, he was seen walking alone along a quiet street near the Hollywood Hills, dusk falling over the city. There were no cameras nearby, no spotlight waiting. The few who passed him wouldn't have recognized the man beneath the cap and gray hoodie carrying 2 grocery bags. He stopped when he saw an elderly man struggling to lift a walker into the back of a rideshare. Without hesitation, Keanu set his bags down and helped, speaking gently, steadying the man's arm as he climbed into the car. "Thank you, young man," the driver said. Keanu smiled. "Take care of him," he said. The car door closed, the engine started, and the street fell quiet again. He picked up his bags and continued walking until the streetlights swallowed him in amber light. Somewhere across town, a talk show replayed the viral footage of his confrontation. Analysts dissected his every word, and columnists wrote essays about the moral weight of modern celebrity. But Keanu wasn't watching. He was at home, feeding his dog, washing a few dishes, and setting aside a stack of books to donate to the hospital's new reading wing. Later, as the night deepened, his publicist called one last time that week. "Are you sure you don't want to say anything?" she asked softly. "Just a short response? You could shape the narrative." Keanu chuckled lightly. "The narrative's fine," he said. "Let them talk. I'll keep working." When the call ended, he stood by the window, the city stretching out below him. Somewhere in the distance, he could still hear the faint echo of applause, the sound of people moved not by a performance, but by a man who refused to perform. He looked up at the stars, quiet and steady, and whispered almost to himself, "Real kindness doesn't need to trend." Then he turned off the light and disappeared into the dark. The shockwaves didn't fade, they evolved. Over the following weeks, Keanu's quiet defiance began shaping something bigger than the original controversy. Editors, producers, and hosts across television took notice. In newsroom meetings and studio huddles, they started asking uncomfortable questions. Why did audiences respond more to humility than to confrontation? Why did a moment of silence move millions more than hours of commentary? One network executive phrased it bluntly, "We've been chasing outrage when people are starving for grace." The statement rippled through the industry. Slowly, shows began to change their tone. Morning panels eased off the interruptions. Late-night segments featured fewer political brawls and more stories about kindness and rebuilding. Even talk show cue cards began carrying small handwritten reminders. Listen first. A few critics, once defenders of the combative format, began to admit it. "We've exhausted the moral theater," wrote a columnist in Variety. "We've mistaken outrage for courage and noise for truth." Keanu Reeves reminded us that decency can still disarm an empire. The internet, which usually moved on within days, didn't this time. Instead, it evolved. A podcast roundtable of journalists, psychologists, and cultural commentators coined a phrase that caught on overnight: the action over announcement ethic. They described it as a return to substance doing good because it's right, not because it trends. Clips from the discussion went viral again, spawning new conversations across platforms. Teenagers on TikTok picked up the phrase and turned it into a challenge: the No Clout Challenge. The rules were simple: do something good for someone, record nothing, tell no one. Within a week, hundreds of thousands of participants were posting blank videos with captions like, "Did a thing today." Not saying what. News anchors, once skeptical of social trends, began ending broadcasts with quiet good news segments. Community heroes who had gone unnoticed for years suddenly became front-page stories. And through it all, one name kept surfacing not because he said anything new, but because he hadn't said anything at all. In every discussion, Keanu's silence became the touchstone for authenticity in a noisy age. Mid-video interactive prompt #3, on-screen and voiceover. What's one quiet good deed you've seen lately that deserves respect? Give them a shout-out. The question flashed on screens, sparking thousands of heartfelt comments that flooded the video's midsection real stories of real kindness, proving that the reset had already begun. The Keanu effect, as the media began calling it, didn't fade with the news cycle. It matured into a movement. Community centers began organizing quiet giving days, encouraging volunteers to donate time, meals, or supplies without tagging or posting. The tone of the internet, usually sharp-edged and impatient, softened for a while. Comment sections under trending videos filled not with sarcasm, but with gratitude. Podcasts that once thrived on controversy shifted their focus. One host admitted on air, "I've built a career out of outrage, but after watching him walk away, I started asking if I'm feeding anger or understanding." The admission trended on its own. Educational channels joined in. High school ethics teachers used the segment in class discussions about integrity. Students debated whether public advocacy or private service made the greater impact, and one teacher summed it up perfectly. Both matter, but one of them can't exist without humility. Meanwhile, online creators took it even further. The No Clout Challenge exploded. Teenagers filmed themselves covering their cameras with their palms, using captions like, "Did something kind today. You'll just have to imagine it." Millions followed suit. For the first time in years, a social trend wasn't about visibility, it was about sincerity. In small towns and big cities alike, unexpected stories began surfacing. A civic group in Wisconsin reported a 30% increase in anonymous donations to food banks. A community shelter in Atlanta received envelopes filled with gift cards labeled only "From someone who still believes in quiet good." Even major charities noticed an uptick in contributions made without credit requests. Network executives took note. Several morning shows restructured their segments, replacing confrontation panels with local hero spotlights. Ratings stabilized, not from shock value, but from trust slowly returning. "It feels better," one producer confessed. "For the first time, we're giving viewers oxygen instead of fire." Everywhere the same question echoed had one man's silence recalibrated the tone of a culture too used to noise. In an interview months later, a sociologist summed it up best. Keanu didn't start a movement by speaking. He did it by proving stillness has power. The louder the world got, the more his quiet became the answer people were searching for. And people kept searching, one quiet good deed at a time. Months later, the ripple had become a current. The world hadn't turned perfect, far from it, but something subtle had shifted. People paused more before speaking. Online arguments cooled faster. And the word humility, once dismissed as outdated, found its way back into everyday language. A journalist writing for The Guardian noted, "In an era obsessed with influence, Keanu Reeves reminded us that integrity still counts. You can lead quietly and still be heard everywhere." The article went viral, not for its style, but for its truth. In neighborhoods across America, people began noticing one another again. A teenager shoveling an elderly neighbor's driveway. A cafe owner slipping a free meal to a homeless man without posting it online. A nurse leaving flowers at a colleague's car. Little acts, quiet moments, each one inspired by a simple example that no one asked for and everyone needed. Back in Los Angeles, Keanu kept moving through his days unchanged. The noise around him faded, replaced by life's steady rhythm. Film rehearsals, board meetings, small kindnesses no one recorded. He still refused interviews about that moment. "It wasn't about me," he'd tell those who asked. But the world had already decided differently. To them, he'd done more than stand for grace. He'd reset the compass. In the months that followed, as the noise of media cycles ebbed and the world moved to its next story, something quieter began to take its place. It wasn't broadcast or trending, it was handwritten, folded, and mailed. Letters began arriving at Keanu's small foundation office, sealed in envelopes from across the country. They weren't fan mail, not exactly. They were testimonies, soft-spoken echoes of lives he had unknowingly touched. The staff at his foundation started collecting them in a single box. Some came on lined notebook paper, others on crumpled receipts or torn envelopes. A janitor wrote first. His words were simple, the handwriting rough but sincere. "I worked cleanup on the set of your last film," it began. "I didn't think anyone noticed me, but you asked about my son's baseball game that day. A year later, when you came back to shoot another scene, you remembered his name." He couldn't believe it. Neither could I. That meant more than any autograph ever could. Another letter came from a high school student in Ohio. "I was failing out of school," she wrote. "I didn't think I had options. Someone from your foundation paid for my welding program. It wasn't public. It wasn't even under your name. I only found out because the director told me. I'm working now, full-time. I have a purpose." Each story carried the same quiet rhythm: gratitude without fanfare, transformation without spectacle. Then there was the nurse's letter. The staff read it in silence. "You won't remember me," it said. "I work nights at Street Luke's. Last year, a man lost his wife in our ward. No family, no friends. You came in quietly that night to deliver toys for the children's unit. But you saw him sitting there, crying into his hands. You didn't speak right away. You just sat beside him for almost an hour, until he stopped shaking. He never knew who you were, but I did. They placed that one at the top of the pile. It didn't need a reply. It already had one, written in silence, years before." As the letters kept coming, the box on the foundation desk filled faster than anyone expected. Each envelope carried a different kind of story, a different kind of gratitude. Some were typed, some scribbled in pencil, but all shared the same message: small lives changed by small kindnesses that never made the news. One came from a bus driver in Detroit. "I used to work night shifts outside the studio," he wrote. "One rainy morning you came out, saw my tire was flat, and helped me fix it. You never said your name, but I knew. You shook my hand like I was an equal. You don't know what that meant. Nobody ever does that for us." Another came from a father in Florida. "You donated to our local music program years ago. My daughter learned violin through that grant. She's now teaching at the same school. We found your name only after she tried to write a thank you letter. It was the first time I saw her believe in her own future." The stories grew more personal with each letter. Some were short, barely a paragraph. Others stretched pages, telling of dark nights turned light by an act so small it might have gone unnoticed. A grocery store cashier, a teacher, a mechanic. They all said the same thing: he gave them back their sense of worth. One afternoon, as his assistant sorted through another batch, she found a small envelope addressed simply to Mr. K. Inside were crayon drawings on notebook paper, uneven lines, and bright colors. Children had drawn stick figures, one taller, one smaller, standing under a smiling sun. At the bottom, written in a child's shaky handwriting, were 3 words: "You helped us." When Keanu saw it, he didn't say anything at first. He smiled, turned the page over, and read a short note from a volunteer at the children's ward. "They asked if they could draw something for you. They said you made the hospital less scary." He folded the drawing carefully, as if it were glass, and held it for a long moment before walking to the corkboard by his desk. The corkboard was already dotted with reminders of quiet moments: a photo of the hospital reading room, a handwritten thank you from a teacher, a faded newspaper clipping about a scholarship student who'd become a firefighter. But this new drawing felt different. It wasn't about accomplishment. It was about innocence, about being seen through the eyes of a child. Keanu pinned the paper gently at the center. The stick figures smiled back at him, one tall, one small, both holding a red heart between them. Beneath it, in crooked letters, the caption read, "Thank you, Mr. K." He stepped back, and looked at it in silence. The late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, warming the edges of the paper. In that stillness, all the noise of the past months, the headlines, the talk shows, the arguments, seemed to fade into insignificance. This, he thought, was the only reward that ever mattered. His assistant peeked through the doorway, hesitant. "More letters came," she said softly. He smiled. "Let's keep them safe." She nodded, placing the growing stack beside the corkboard box. "People really love you, Keanu." He shook his head slowly. "They love what goodness reminds them of," he said. "I just try to reflect it back." As evening fell, the office lights dimmed. Keanu lingered by the corkboard one last time, tracing the child's crayon heart with his eyes. The color was bright, almost defiant against the fading light. A small act of faith, drawn by tiny hands. He whispered quietly, "That's what it's all for." Then he turned off the lamp, leaving only the soft glow of the city filtering through the window. On the board, the drawing caught that faint light, its red heart glowing faintly in the dark, a symbol of a man who chose kindness over applause and silence over spectacle. Somewhere outside, the world still talked, still debated, still dissected. But inside that quiet room, one truth stood untouched. Sometimes the smallest thanks meant more than the loudest recognition. And for Keanu Reeves, that truth was enough. A full year passed before anyone realized how deeply that moment had reshaped things. What once seemed like a controversy had become a quiet legacy, the kind that doesn't fade. It settles into culture like a seed that keeps growing. The world had moved through countless new headlines, but Keanu's calm defiance still echoed, not in arguments, but in actions. His latest film, The Guardian Redemption, had outlived its release cycle. Families still watched it together on streaming nights, not just for its story, but for what it symbolized: integrity, compassion, and strength, without arrogance. Fan art flooded online spaces for months afterward, not of explosions or fight scenes, but of bridges. People had drawn literal bridges between hearts, hands, and faces from different worlds. It wasn't just a movie now. It had become a metaphor. In classrooms across the country, educators began using the viral interview as a teaching tool. At Columbia's School of Journalism, a new course unit appeared in the syllabus titled Accountability versus Ambush, a Case Study. The class dissected the segment, pausing to analyze tone, framing, and ethics. The professor asked students, "What's the difference between asking for truth and demanding performance?" The room fell silent before a student replied softly, "Respect." That word became the day's lesson. Meanwhile, The View returned from its seasonal break under a quieter banner. The graphics were simpler, the tone less combative. Joy Behar was on extended leave, as the official statement read, though insiders whispered it had been encouraged. The new episodes featured more listening, fewer interruptions, and a renewed emphasis on empathy. Critics noticed. Viewers noticed. The change didn't come from policy, it came from reflection. Behind the scenes, ABC leadership implemented new segment standards emphasizing context before confrontation. Producers were told to prioritize conversation that enlightens, not spectacle that burns. No one said Keanu's name during these meetings, but his presence was in every sentence. One late-night host summed it up best during a monologue. He didn't win the argument, he changed the temperature. And that, it seemed, was his real victory. Outside the media world, Keanu's quiet example had rippled into entirely different corners of life. Nonprofits began adopting what they called quiet transparency, a policy that shared outcomes, not donors. Instead of posting photos of celebrity funders or red carpet charity galas, they focused on measurable change: children fed, students supported, communities rebuilt. The Reeves Foundation was one of the first to publish this new kind of report. It listed numbers, not names, pages of projects, budgets, and results, but not a single credit line. At the bottom, one sentence stood alone: "Impact is its own applause." The phrase was picked up by other organizations, printed on newsletters and banners, echoed in conferences about ethics and social responsibility. At a small ceremony in Los Angeles, where a children's hospital unveiled a new rehabilitation wing funded in part by Keanu's foundation, a nurse spoke to the crowd. "He asked us not to thank him," she said, smiling. "So instead, we thank each other." The audience applauded softly, almost reverently. It wasn't a spectacle, it was a renewal of values. In universities, philosophy and ethics professors began including the Keanu paradigm, a shorthand for moral authenticity in a media-saturated world. Students studied his reaction not as a celebrity moment, but as an act of modern stoicism. Essays debated whether silence could ever be louder than protest. One paper concluded, "True conviction doesn't announce itself, it endures." Even within Hollywood, something shifted. A few younger actors cited him as their compass, choosing projects that prioritize meaning over profit. Interviews grew gentler, less performative. It was subtle, but real. And through it all, Keanu remained exactly as he had been, unmoved by fame's noise, uninterested in rewriting the narrative. When asked about the cultural effect of that moment, his longtime friend and producer laughed. "He probably doesn't even know. He's too busy living it." Indeed, Keanu spent that anniversary week just as he had spent the one before, attending a board call for the Literacy Foundation, visiting a mechanic he'd quietly helped years ago, and spending evenings reading scripts that told stories about redemption and grace. The public called it influence. He called it Tuesday. A year to the day after that fateful broadcast, a reporter spotted Keanu leaving a small cafe in West Hollywood. Cameras clicked from across the street. She raised her voice over the noise of traffic. "Mr. Reeves, do you have any comment on how your moment changed television?" He didn't stop. He didn't need to. He smiled warmly, gave a small wave, and as he reached the cafe door, he noticed a delivery driver struggling with a stack of boxes. Without hesitation, he held the door open, steadying the load with one hand. The reporter's microphone lowered slowly. That was the answer, right there in front of her. The photo hit the internet within hours. Keanu Reeves, mid-step, holding a door for a stranger, unaware that 1,000 lenses were watching again. But this time, the captions were different. They didn't sensationalize. They simply said, "Still the same." Later that evening, as city lights shimmered against the skyline, a journalist wrote the closing paragraph of a retrospective piece. "Some revolutions happen with noise, others with grace. A man walked away from a stage 1 year ago and somehow taught us all to listen again." It became the most shared sentence of the week. And Keanu Reeves, unaware of the latest headline, was somewhere else entirely quietly living what he'd already taught the world. There are moments that divide the noise from the meaning, and what happened that morning in the studio became one of them. In a culture obsessed with visibility, a single act of quiet defiance rewrote what strength looked like. Keanu Reeves didn't win an argument or silence a critic. He simply stood for something that didn't need defending authenticity. As the story echoed through time, the lesson became clear. There isn't only one way to make a difference. There isn't a single volume that defines virtue. Some shout to be heard, others whisper, and are remembered longer. Keanu showed that living your values, day after day, in small, unseen ways, is its own form of revolution. That moment when he unclipped his microphone still lingers like a symbol. A man choosing character over clout. A quiet gesture that said everything words couldn't. The mic resting on the chair wasn't just equipment, it became a message to millions. Integrity doesn't perform, it simply exists. It reminded the world that the loudest voices aren't always the most truthful. Sometimes, the people doing the most good are the ones no one's looking at. The teacher who stays late after class, the nurse who works a double shift, the neighbor who checks on the elderly man down the hall. These aren't stories that trend, but they're stories that keep the world standing. If you're someone who's been doing your best without applause, this story is for you. If you've ever wondered whether small kindness matters when no one sees it, it does. You matter. The way you live, the way you give, the way you show up for others, all of it counts, even if no one's recording. The world doesn't need everyone to broadcast their goodness. It needs people who quietly live it. That's why what Keanu did on that stage wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an act of remembrance of what decency looks like when it's stripped of applause. He didn't argue to win. He spoke to remind. He reminded everyone that kindness doesn't require permission, that humility isn't weakness, and that strength often shows itself in stillness. The image of that empty chair, the microphone resting quietly on the arm, became a piece of modern folklore. People shared it for weeks, not because it was dramatic, but because it was human. It became a mirror for anyone who's ever been misunderstood for choosing peace over performance. In a time when every opinion feels like a demand for allegiance, his calm refusal to divide became an invitation to unite. It wasn't about being right, it was about being real. And that, more than anything, was what made the world stop and listen. Maybe that's the message buried beneath all the headlines. The courage to stay kind when anger is trending. The discipline to stay grounded when the world tempts you to rise on noise. The wisdom to know that character is not what you post, it's what you practice. So if you're listening to this, ask yourself a simple question. Do you believe quiet integrity can change culture more than loud performance? Because maybe that's where it starts, with one person choosing decency instead of division, with one voice choosing respect instead of rage, with one act of goodness no one expects and no one sees. And maybe, just maybe, that's how we begin to heal. So tell us in the comments, what story about everyday dignity should we explore next with Keanu Reeves, whose unseen goodness deserves to be told? As the scene fades, imagine one final picture. It's late evening. The studio lights have long gone dark. In a quiet office hallway, Keanu stands beside a custodian, balancing a mop bucket. He presses the elevator button, waits, and smiles. The doors open, and before he steps in, he holds them for the man beside him. No cameras, no sound. Just one more quiet act of grace before the door closes. The screen fades to black, the door closes slowly, and in that silence, the message lands. Dignity doesn't need an audience. Integrity doesn't need applause. And the people who quietly do what's right every day are the ones truly holding the world together. That's the heartbeat behind every moment you've just witnessed. The unseen current that keeps decency alive in a world that often forgets it. Keanu's story in that studio wasn't about humiliation or victory. It was about remembrance. It reminded us that real strength is calm, that real conviction listens, and that real influence doesn't need to announce itself. He left behind more than a moment he left a mirror, and each of us decides what we see in it. Maybe you're the teacher who stays after class to encourage a struggling student. Maybe you're the father working 2 jobs quietly to keep a promise. Maybe you're the nurse who holds a frightened hand in the middle of a long night. You might never trend at all, but the impact you leave echoes longer than any spotlight ever could. So as we close, remember this. You don't have to stand on a stage to stand your ground. You don't need a microphone to make your voice matter. Your kindness, your honesty, your patience in the face of cruelty, those are the real acts that shape the world. If you're listening right now and you've ever felt unseen, this story is a quiet salute to you. To everyone choosing character over convenience, empathy over ego, and grace over noise, this is your reminder that what you do counts. Before you go, take a moment to reflect. Do you believe quiet integrity can change culture more than loud performance? And what story of everyday dignity should we share next with Keanu Reeves? Type your thoughts below. Someone's life might change because of the story you help us tell next. The elevator door closes. The world outside keeps moving. But kindness, real, living, breathing kindness, keeps the lights on for all of us.